Racism has plagued football pretty much since its inception, with Everton centre forward Dixie Dean being one of the first players to recall racist comments that were made to him during his career in the 1930s. But perhaps it was during the 1980s at where it was most rampant in the English game. West Ham's Ade Coker blamed influence from the political movement, the National Front, for what he saw as infecting the terraces with racist bigotry. Since then, great strides have been made in tackling all forms of discrimination from the beautiful game. Organisations such as Kick It Out have tirelessly worked to educate and campaign in the hope to eradicate the abuse. Despite this, January 2020 saw a sharp rise of racism incidents by more than 50% in the calendar year. Many people fell in love with Italian football during the 90s. Football Italia on Channel 4, Baggio, Maldini, Rui Costa, the list is endless. What was also endless was the rampant racism. Unlike English football, Calcio is still all too familiar with shameful incidents that have left lots of the modern world gawping in disbelief. This has left many people scratching their heads at where to point the finger. Inter Milan striker Romelu Lukaku publicly accused the Italian media of fueling the negativity and the racism. So, this study is going to try and find out, is the Italian media complacent in their fight against racism, and how does it compare to the UK press? Alberto Testa, in his book Football, Fascism and Fandom, wrote that the Italian media, for instance, have greatly contributed to the popularity of the game. The media have a tremendous influence. This could not have been truer in the case of football wildcard Mario Balotelli. In 2012, Balotelli became the first black player to represent Italy during a major tournament. His debut was met with chants of "There are no black Italians" from the Italian ultras. With this monumental point in the history of Italian football, a huge weight was put on the press to rightfully lambast the tifosi for their racist abuse. Instead, La Gazzetta dello Sport published a cartoon depicting the striker as King Kong. English newspaper The Guardian revealed their disbelief at the Italian press when writing, "Mario's very presence in the Italian team is symbolic on so many levels. The Italian media ought to champion the individual rather than singling him out as a scapegoat and somehow inferior to his international teammates." In Mark Dorgi's book Football Italia, he wrote, "During the 1980s there was a growth in ultra groups who expressed far-right political views. This was also accompanied by the European Research Centre on Migration and Ethnic Relations confirming that, in the 1990s, Italian press coverage on immigration was dominated by negative themes. This seemingly created a perfect balance to fuel racism from the terraces. Without explicitly expressing hatred towards footballers from Bayern backgrounds, racism became the norm. Bringing this to the modern day, very little seemingly has changed. A journalist from La Repubblica, Paolo Baresi, wrote a book, Nazi Italia, describing the commonplace racism takes in Italian society. Because of this book, Baresi had to be placed under protective escort. This book outlines how racism isn't necessarily as clear-cut as a racially aggravated assault and could just be name-calling in a playground. And just like that, unconscious racism. Defined as implicit racism, which includes unconscious bias, expectations and tendencies that exist within an individual regardless of ill will or self-aware prejudices. This concept is one hotly debated among journalists. In an excellent TED Talk, Pat Ferrucci highlighted the problematic situations where this can take place.
Journalists and broadcasters consistently and constantly stereotype athletes by race through their word choices. Intelligence, background, motivation, physical strength, effort, leadership, right? These are all word choices that journalists make when they're talking about athletes, but they do so in a racialized manner.
Ferrucci goes on to compare NFL quarterbacks Tom Brady and Cam Newton. In this comparison, he points out that despite possessing many of the same skill sets, Newton is attributed with physical strength and natural talent. Brady, on the other hand, is showered in praise of his intelligence and his hard work. Now, this is just as relevant as in football too. As Christos Kazimieris wrote in his book Football in Black and White, beyond any shadow of a doubt, racism is not confined to the terraces, but stretches over football's prime institutions, clubs, and national local authorities. In that, remarks regarding black players' poor performance when playing in cold and their lack of commitment. In 2016, a similar study was conducted by Cynthia M. Frisby, which determined that black athletes receive significantly more negative media press than white male counterparts. With this pre-existing literature in mind, my hypothesis is that throughout my study, key themes will appear such as references to physical strength and just overall negative language towards the black athletes. Also, given how critical the English press have been of the Italian media's coverage of racist incidents, there should be a distinct difference between the two countries in terms of data. So, how did I create this study? The first stage was designing the coding framework. These choices were inspired from both past studies and Ferrucci's theory of problematic language by journalists. Starting with finances mentioned. This choice was made because of common themes from British newspapers reporting on Man City star Raheem Sterling. These outlets were highlighted by Sterling himself, who shunned the papers for highlighting the finances much more than other players. The criteria for this code is any financial figures referring to the athlete, such as transfer fees or wages. Nationality. Referring to Max Moreau's book, The Balotelli Generation, Italian football has a stubborn view on nationalism. This is important in the reporting of foreign talent in the country. The criteria for this code are when athlete's nationality is mentioned in the articles. Positive attitude. This code refers back to Kazimieris' idea that inapt remarks are made regarding black players' lack of commitment. Criteria for this is when the journalist compliments the athlete's attitude or mentality. Mentioned, this code is in reference to unconventional families, i.e. children out of wedlock. Next, African heritage being mentioned. This code refers to the two athletes chosen for the study, more on that later, who both have African roots. This is important as neither athlete was born in the continent, but could be interestingly referred to as African. Playing statistics. This criteria for this code is any statistics, good or bad, referring to their performance. This could be a way of praising the athlete in an unbiased way. Next is physical attributes. This code is the crux of Ferrucci's argument of how black athletes are praised through their natural physical strength rather than their hard work. The criteria for this code being any mention of the athlete's size, strength, or physical power. Next up is intelligence. This code refers to all mentions to the athlete's intelligence or skills relating to intelligence, i.e. languages spoken. Weight. The criteria for this is any mention of the size or insinuating the athlete is out of shape, and it's through the lack of dedication as to why. Racism being mentioned. This code is to highlight if the journalist calls racism by name. When the writer doesn't do this, it could be seen as tiptoeing around the issue. Racism being excused/condoned. This code highlights when terms such as not all fans and using terminology that is critical towards the accuser of racism. Racism being denounced. The criteria for this being openly denouncing of the racist actions. And finally, we have negative language use. This code refers to any language that is antagonistic towards the athlete. A common example of this is a player being referred to as a flop. The next step was deciding on the subject. As Romelu Lukaku was one of the most outspoken against the Italian media, his case was more suitable. On the English side of the study, Antonio Rudiger's case was one of the most high profile. The similarities between the cases gives extra credence as both athletes are foreign players in their respective countries they play in. Both players have a history of being targeted by racists, and both players have African parents, and both incidents led to no action being taken by the league's organising bodies. The Belgian was racially abused on the 1st of September 2019 by repeat offenders Calgary fans. Rudiger, on the other hand, was racially abused by Tottenham fans on the 22nd of February 2020. With the subjects decided, it was a case of narrowing down the time frame. To gather an appropriate number of articles, a time frame of a month before each separate incident and the month following was decided on. All articles regarding the athletes in this time period have been coded using the framework previously described. An important implication of my study is the news outlets that would be selected. With Corriere dello Sport being accused by Lukaku himself and being publicly shamed for their Black Friday headline, it was a clear choice for one of the Italian papers. The other Italian news outlet chosen would be radically leftist La Repubblica. The idea between these choices was to give the study a balanced view on what the Italian public would read. Similarly, many British players have spoken out against the Daily Mail for fueling racism, i.e. Raheem Sterling. To accompany this, England's best-selling controversial newspaper The Sun was also chosen. To prevent personal bias, it was integral that even coverage was collected and the same framework applied to all four sources. Preparing the data for analysis was done via Excel. The coding tables were tallied up and turned into comparable tables. So after 170 coded articles, I could start to work out the average time each code is used for each respective condition. To work out the average, I divided each number of codes accumulated by how many articles were coded in each condition. What was left at the end of the study was a table for each condition, for example, Corriere dello Sport 1 month before the Lukaku incident. To start with that one, the data shows that both finances and weight were leading the way with the average amount used, with finances racking up an average of 1.27 per article and weight a perhaps unexpected high of 1.81. As this was Lukaku's first month of being an Inter Milan player, it's probably unsurprising that this was so much media attention towards the shape he was in and the money he was on. Slightly more peculiar is the lack of mention of the Belgian's intelligence and the fact he is fluent in Italian. This would seem information that would be general interest to the Italian public. Looking at La Repubblica's reporting during the same time frame, there is also a recurring mention of financial figures. There is a clear contrast on the reporting of Lukaku's weight, with it only being mentioned on average 0.17 times. There is also a difference in the description of the striker's nationality and African heritage, which could be important as previously mentioned, nationalism is a huge part of Italian culture. Now, to the English press. Starting with the Daily Mail, there is little media interest in Antonio Rudiger. But in the articles that were reported on the German, there is a theme of reporting his nationality and positive attitude. Racking up an average of 0.8 and 0.6, comparing this to The Sun, we can see the reporting on Rudiger's weight that the Daily Mail didn't mention once in the same time period. There is also a distinct mention to Rudiger's physical attributes. When examining the Italian media's coverage the month following the racist incident involving Romelu Lukaku, it paints a very different picture. Firstly, Corriere dello Sport has a worryingly high usage of language that can be perceived as excusing racism, with an average of 1.33. This pales in comparison to language that completely denounces the racist actions, with only an average of 0.57. There is also a sharp increase in negative language used towards Lukaku. Comparing this data to liberal newspaper La Repubblica, there is a stark contrast between the two. La Repubblica has a better habit of mentioning racism by name and a much less average of excusing racism at only 0.36. The paper also has a higher denounced average of 0.95, with 0 cases of negative language towards the striker. Now, let's examine how the English media respond to the racism in the national game. Looking at the Daily Mail's response, there is clearly a rightful sharp increase of interest of Antonio Rudiger. In a fairly balanced dataset, the Daily Mail's most used language is that of denouncing the incident, but alarmingly there's an average of 0.53 in terms of excusing of racism. The Sun has very similar data, with a racism denounced average of 0.90 and racism excused at 0.50. When comparing the dataset as a whole, we firstly need to look at how the news outlets conducted themselves a month prior to the incidents. As seen on the graph, we can always see that the Italian news lead the way in many of the fields, but interestingly, they are the only newspaper to mention the player's African heritage, albeit small averages with 0.09 and 0.13. This could be very telling. Would the birthplace of a white player's parents be deemed integral information? Whilst this may seem extra detail about the player for the regular consumer, Tester Armstrong 2008 confirms that for the racists, the player was guilty of having a Somalian mother. This is in reference to the Lazio fans racially abusing Fabio Liverani. When comparing all the news outlets' responses after the incident, you get an interesting result. La Repubblica are the only news outlet of the selection that makes any reference to the athlete's attitude in a positive light or his intelligence. Also, La Repubblica leads the way in calling racism by name, has the highest denounced average, and uses language excusing racism the least, with 0.36. Overall, there is still some mention of the athlete's physical attributes. Notably, despite being the victims of racist abuse, the athletes are still having negative language written against them by both an English and an Italian paper. To get direct contrast between the two countries, I produced this graph. This visual aid shows how each country's media operates. To get this data, both newspapers from each country's data was accumulated together. The graph clearly shows that the Italian press use language that excuses racism more and denounces racism less than their English counterparts. More damning, it displays that the Italian media highlights the athlete's African heritage while England does not. Additionally, the Italian press stresses many details, much more such as the player's nationality and the physical attributes. So, how does the outcome compare to my hypothesis? Well, the answer is blurred. Previously mentioned, Ferrucci's theory is that physical strength is used commonly, referring to black players, and intelligence is not. The study throughout supports this concept. In particular, Lukaku can speak 8 different languages, yet his intelligence is less than an afterthought by the Italian media. Both the Italian and English media regularly reference the athlete's physical attributes at length, but despite there being a difference between the two countries, the data leaves us in a pretty ambiguous position. Is the disparity great enough to condemn the Italian media as guilty? To answer this question, it's important to evaluate what falls through the cracks in a study of this kind. For example, there is multiple cases of the Italian media publishing statements from the ultras without comment, and whilst this doesn't flag up in the framework as condoning or denouncing racism, it is giving people who are condoning racism a platform to explain themselves. And when the ultra statements are as narrow-minded as this, it's dangerous. So, in conclusion, to answer the question of the study, we have to do it in 2 parts. Is the Italian media complacent in the fight against racism? Yes. Despite their widespread rejecting this claim, there is much more they can do to combat the widespread problem of racism in their stadia. To put the whole blame on the media when the country as a whole is still obsessed with the idea of nationalism is harsh, but essentially without unified denunciation that is repeated without question, any sort of efforts are undermined. So, how does it compare to the UK press? Unfortunately, there is many similarities between the two. Whilst without doubt the stats favour the English press, but they're far from perfect, there is still a scurrily amount of language that excuses racist incidents. This suggests that whilst there isn't many Black Friday-esque headlines in the newsstands, it's likely that unconscious racism still creeps into the subtext.